So good evening, everybody. I'm Kathy Willis. I'm the principal of St Edmund Hall, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you to our first In Conversation series. And now this is a student-suggested initiative to have discussions and talks and debates in Teddy Hall around diversity in culture, race and gender. So we could not have wished for a better first speaker than Professor Barbara Savage, who is a scholar of 20th century African American history with a focus on political and intellectual history, religious history, and also women's history. She's based at the University of Pennsylvania and chair of its Department of Africana Studies, but many of you might have seen Barbara when she was here in Oxford in 2018 as the visiting Harmsworth professor. I urge you to look at books that Barbara has written, because I had a look this afternoon and I have already ordered some. She's written some really fantastic books, including Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, The Politics of Black Religion and Broadcasting Freedom, Radio War and the Politics of Race. Both of these have won really prestigious awards, not unsurprisingly. So Barbara's now going to be in conversation with our own fellow in French literature, Professor Wes Williams, who also wears another hat, which is as director of Torch. And so they're going to talk about Merze Tate, who is a pioneering Black woman diplomatic historian and a faculty member at Harvard University from 1942 to 1977. So Wes and Barbara, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I will say just one or two more words of introduction and also housekeeping. Generally, so the way this will run is that after this brief introduction, Barbara is going to read, talk a bit about Merze Tate, read a bit from her biography of Merze Tate, and then she and I will have a bit of a conversation between us because it's a kind of reverse tutorial. I've been reading her work for the last couple of weeks, and it's a great honor then to be able to talk to her about it. It's not often you get to have a tutorial with the person who actually wrote the books, although that's kind of the idea in Oxford partly. And then there'll be questions from you, the audience, and others, people on screen. I would ask that people muted and also probably took their cameras off for now, if they're not either Barbara or myself. I'm not going to tell the principal to turn her camera off because she's the principal, but if she wants to, she can. She's just done so, that's fine. I want to start then by, as Kathy said, I'm a professor of French, and one of the things that Barbara may or may not say is that one of the things that brought Merze Tate to Europe was a desire to study French history at the Sorbonne, and she went on to many other things. I'd like to think she didn't quite leave all the French history behind, or indeed the French literature that clearly informed some of her ideas about freedom and about equality. But we're not really here to talk about French literature. We're here to talk about Merze Tate, and also what I will try and do is to try and entangle really the two lives, that of Merze Tate and that of our speaker, because I think there are connections to be made between these two lives, as well as the lives of the students in Oxford, some of whom are here on screen with us. Without further ado, though, then I'll hand over to Barbara to get us going. Thank you, first of all, so much for coming. I'll repeat what Kathy said. And thank you for responding to this request for your time.
Great. It's an honor to have been asked to do this. I've been looking forward to it, and I want to certainly thank Kathy and Wes for coordinating this, and also my good friend Elaine Evers, who was at Queens College, helping to host me when I was there in 2018, 2019. So it's just really nice to be able to do this. And I thought I would do a couple of things just to get started, in part because some of you will maybe just hearing about Tate for the first time. There may be others of you who will be getting tired of hearing about Tate. And so what I thought I would do to kick us off is actually to read a snippet from what's now the draft of the book, which when I was there it was not drafted. That's been one of the consequences, I guess, of the COVID lockdown, as I actually was able to finish the draft. So I'm just gonna jump right in, and then I will say some other things, and then we'll open it up to questions. but this is how I'm thinking about opening the book now, if you'll go with me for a minute or two. On a spring evening in 1921, over 400 people crammed into a high school auditorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, to witness an annual student oratorical contest where one girl and one boy would be crowned winners. Merze Tate, a 16-year-old girl, stood in front of the predominantly white audience and proclaimed into their silence that, quote, "For 244 years, my ancestors were held in bonds of slavery, deprived of every opportunity for mental development, civil expression, and hindered in their pursuits of human endeavor, and saw continued hatred and denial after emancipation." But as she said, in the time of global war, whites had once again, quote, "called upon 2 million Black men from Africa, from the West Indies, and from America to fight that the world might enjoy the benefits of civilization. They fought as men, they fought nobly, they fought gloriously." Despite that, she argued, Black men around the world were still, quote, "deprived of his liberties, his democracies, and his glorious privileges for which he had so nobly fought." Tate did not falter as she made one bold plea after the other, saying, "Oh, America." She demanded in the name of 14 million of my people that they too be extended a fair chance at jobs and freedoms that were then opening to recent immigrants. She reached back into anti-slavery rhetoric that deftly deployed the image of the heroic Black soldier, focusing particularly on Toussaint Louverture. With that, she rested her case for an end to racial inequality while teaching her audience about the continuing consequences of slavery, the sacrifices of Black soldiers from the United States, the Caribbean, and Africa, and the continued denial of common justice to Black people here and around the globe. By invoking Toussaint, she held high the name of the Black liberator warrior of Haiti, but she also honored the Black men in her own family who had served in the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, and her older brother who had been in the Navy in World War I. Miss Merze Tate, a colored girl, was the winner for the girls' division of the contest, her subject being the Negro in the World War, reported the Battle Creek Inquirer the next day. Although she was only a high school junior, Tate's performance showcased her intellect and her confidence, her devotion to research and hard work, her racial consciousness, and her competitiveness. She had begun already as a teenager to make a place for herself in a world that routinely disrespected Black women and men as intellectual, political, and moral inferiors. Her speech demonstrated the courage and the prodigious intellectual gifts that would carry her from rural Michigan to graduate degrees in the 1930s from Columbia, and thanks to a fellowship from her sorority, from Oxford International Relations in 1935. And I'll come back and say more about her time there. After teaching at Southern Black colleges, she went on to earn a PhD in government from Harvard in 1941. And from there, she assumed a 35-year professorship at Howard University, a rare achievement for women, and especially Black women of her generation. So starting in the 1930s and spanning 5 decades, she published 5 groundbreaking books, 2 from Harvard and 1 from Yale, and dozens of articles on diplomatic history and international relations, focusing first on disarmament and later on US and European imperialism in Asia, the Pacific, Africa, and elsewhere. She was among that minority of African-American scholars in the humanities and social sciences who did not study domestic racial matters. Instead, although through her large body of published work, Tate theorized what I call an anti-racist geopolitics, which she deployed cohesively across regions rarely studied together by a single scholar. Across disparate regions and times, she kept her focus on the technologies of imperialism, brilliantly conceptualized by her to include not only armaments and warships and planes, but also missionaries, railroads, ports, and transnational corporate capital. She traveled solo around the world twice and reached every continent but 2, spent a year in India in 1950 on a Fulbright grant, and later endowed millions of dollars in scholarships that today still send students to college. In her lifetime of travels, she found herself in the presence of Adolf Hitler, Pope Pius XII, Nehru, and Desmond Tutu, to name a few. Her travel informed her work and vice versa, as there are few substitutes for seeing firsthand the places one is studying, in archives by day and certainly socially in leisure. The touchstones of her travels, returns from travel, were friends and families eager to welcome her and to hear of her adventures. She never married and had no children, and led a vibrant social life in Washington, across the US and around the world. Her leisure was fed by her broad intellectual and cultural interests, by her prowess at the bridge table, by her skills as a chef and party giver, and by her gift for sustaining friendships across time and space. Tate moved with the hurried, athletic grace of intentionality and purpose, dressed in the latest styles and finest fabrics popular in the social and professional worlds she inhabited. This then, referring to the book that I'm trying to finish, is the story of how a young Black girl born in 1905 on an isolated farm in the center of Michigan pursued her twin dreams of becoming a scholar and of traveling the world with her cameras in hand. Her intellectual curiosity and her travel lust became the dual reinforcing pleasures of her life. Those powerful desires and their gratification drove her to explore the wider world and to pursue the creative work of research, writing, and teaching. The models for her life her models for the life she willed into being were few, and fewer still for Black women of her generation. Hers was an extremely unusual personal and professional path, a rarity made greater because she did not come from the small Black Eastern elite or from educated parents, but rather from Midwestern homesteaders. So that's how I'm trying to opening the book, if you will. And I tried then to write an accessible account of her life that focuses on the inspirational aspects of her travel and her struggles, but also takes seriously her work and analyze it in some detail through the course of the book. But I want to end just to spend a couple of minutes on her time at Oxford to say something about that. So she arrived in 1932 with the intent, well, her intent was to get a graduate degree. She came with very little money, a scholarship for $1,000 that would barely last a year. Once she was there, she was able to finagle her way into the B.Lit program in international relations. After one failed attempt, she was able to get that degree. And it was there that she began her work on disarmament. But she was able to be at Oxford through the concerted efforts of women who were older than she was, but women who had limited authority themselves, but who had some power in the segregated spaces of women's worlds. And that included the Black women's sorority that raised the money to send her there, the white women who welcomed her into the Home Society at Oxford, which is now current St. Anne's College, and the women tutors in the colleges who helped her finish and produce the thesis that she needed for her B.Lit. I'll just say in conclusion, I'm happy to answer a lot of questions about her time there. At the time she was there, she was the only Black American man or woman on the campus or at the university. And she became the first African-American woman to both study there and to receive a graduate degree. And so I'll say more about her time there at Oxford, maybe in the Q&A, because I did have the benefit of reading her student file at St. Anne's College, which gave me a tremendous amount of insight into her time there. So why don't I just leave it at that? And I'm happy to fill in much more detail than you probably want to know.
Yeah. God forbid that all our student files should be readily available to future historians, but they're clearly a big resource. And we would like to hear more about that in due course. But first of all, thank you so much for giving us an overview, but also giving us a kind of sneak preview, if you like, of the beginning of the book. I think it's clear to anybody listening that you write, if I may say so, extraordinarily well in terms of crafting sentences. As a literary critic, I care about the crafting of sentences, but also the crafting of actually a story of a very remarkable character. And I wanted to start there, really, which is this the story of a sort of a one-off individual who could not have, and there are, as it were, no others. I mean, you've talked about her being the first and the only in a number of different places, and yet it's also, as you said right at the end, the story of groups of people who made it possible for that one-off individual, if that's what she is, to do what she's done. I wonder if we could explore that dimension or that tension a bit more to start with.
Sure. I think one of the interesting things about me attempting to write a biography, which I never wanted to do, that was not my aspiration. But I think one of the tensions in doing biography is that, of course, as a biographer, we're drawn to the exceptional life. And the person is exceptional because they achieved this or that, or for any number of, of reasons. And so the challenge for me, the historian, as I worked on her, was to really think about what broader lessons, how much can we learn from this one person's life? I mean, that's ultimately a question. And if you follow the contours of her life and her struggles and her work, you then get a really crisp picture of lots of issues, persistent issues in African-American history and international relations and diplomatic history. So I've tried to read out from this life to see what else are we learning along with her. Certainly, we learn about the times in which she's born and the times in which she works, although I am not calling this a life and times kind of book, because that would look like this, and I am unable to do that. But I do try to talk about some of the broader tensions that her life illustrates, including the challenge, just the idea. I mean, it was a political act for her to dream that she could be a scholar at the time that she did, at a time when that was about as white male dominated as anything, and that was the case through most of her career. So there's still lots of lessons to be learned, much broader than the one life. Yeah.
I really like, it comes through in a number of things that you've written about her, that precisely the kind of the politics of dreaming, the politics of imagining, the kind of the bravery, if that's what it is, I don't know, but the capacity to, I mean, in what you were just saying earlier, you talked about the life that she willed into being. And in one of your essays, you talk about the life and career that she was inventing for herself, inspired by the world. I mean, there's a strong sense in your work that she's making this up. She's following dreams. She's involved in, I guess, what historians would call self-fashioning of a certain kind, but that it's kind of, there isn't quite a model for it, and that she's having to invent this herself. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And more than that, I think that what's interesting, both as a biographer and as a historian, is that she was very invested from early on, from that 16-year-old girl who saved that clipping from the newspaper in a scrapbook that still exists out in Michigan, where she's from. That's the first thing you find in her. So she sees herself already as being historically significant, which I admire. But that she is, because she's so interested in her own self-fashioning, it's a caution for me, because I can follow the archival trail, but I also have to figure out what story is it that I'm telling in the book. I say this is her life, but it's my book. And so I'm the one that's crafting the narrative, what's most important. I'm driving the narrative. Granted, enormously rich archival evidence, which is very unusual for a Black woman of any generation, but especially hers. But there's always the tension between the story she's trying so hard to tell herself, and then the story that I am telling based on the materials of her life, which are scattered about. So that's an interesting tension for a biographer. And so that's been something I've tried to be really cognizant of.
Yeah. And it's clear, as you say, that Oxford is a kind of an important, shall we say, I don't want to say it's a defining moment, but it's a big part of that dream of what it is to be a scholar, and also a big part of what she clearly, again, as a 16-year-old already had, was a sense of her international dimension. This is not somebody who's just going to write about home and about what it is to be a Black woman in a particular place. She has, she's aiming for an international scene and so on. Could you just tell us a bit more about Oxford? And perhaps, again, I don't want to direct you too much, but you noted, one of the things you said early on was that she went around the world camera in hand. Yes. And I'm just interested in that sense of not only am I going to write about myself and save the various clippings that people write about me, but I'm also going to have photographs taken of myself, because there's the famous photo of her in Oxford. And I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Okay, that's like 30 questions in one.
I'm sorry, pick up two.
No, let me just say something quickly about, what I kind of, you work on a project for a long time and you have insights. You think you're kind of done, and then you have a different kind of epiphany, so to speak. And one of the epiphanies I had at the very end of the project was that she's a child born in 1906. So her coming of age in terms of attention to public issues is World War I. Mm-hmm. And so I really do see how, as a child of World War I, coming into teenage years during the war, and having men in her family who served in the military, all of that really was brought home for her. So that's her international orientation really comes from the period of one of the greatest periods of kind of international looking out from American isolationism, if you will, in the 19 teens and 20s. So that was one of the things I think is true. On Oxford, she, as I said, she was there from 1932 to 1935, and she ended up there actually out of both bravado, just like unambiguous ambition, also naivete. She had no idea how to get into Oxford or how one does, never, all of that. And so she really just gave up her home and her teaching and came on as an act of faith, so to speak, and showed up there in 1932. And from that, through her will and the openness of the women who worked with her there, she was able to move into that B.Lit program. She herself says that, looking back over her life, the two most important periods in her life were the 3 years at Oxford and the year that she spent in India. And because of that, I actually agree with, I feel like that's something she's entitled to be the expert on. And I actually agree with it in terms of the contours of her later life. And so the time at Oxford serves as a passport around the world. She will say wherever she travels, if she says she's been at Oxford, especially to the extent that she's moving around sort of the British Commonwealth, that's a door opener, if you will. It certainly is a credential that's extremely impressive to Americans, and think about that in the 1930s, and it still is, today also. But she considered Oxford a dream of a place, which is interesting considering how the kind of loneliness that she also encountered. So she had to be tough enough to deal with the psychological costs of being the only one there in that period. And she was able, I think, to do that through the help of the women at Oxford and the colleges who were able to help her. On the camera and the photography issue, she has dozens and dozens of travel scrapbooks. So I'm able to see not only images of her here and there, but also what she was seeing as she went around the world. And one of the most interesting bits of that for me is that she was in spaces where men would not necessarily have been permitted. So there are lots of really interesting photographs of women and children. And I think that's one of the interesting aspects of the way kind of gender played out for her in her travels. So yes.
So we haven't really talked directly about gender now, but you've just said gender as a kind of way. And I think one of the ways that we might spend another minute or two in Oxford is to think about what's now St Anne's. In other words, those spaces that were on the edges of Oxford, where women were allowed to study and so on. And again, two things there, and I'll try to stick it to. One is, you mentioned the St Anne's student record. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that. And the other is that photo of her in front of the Radcliffe camera on her bicycle. And yes. I wonder if you just say something about what's, in a sense, being staged there, or why that photo has the power that it does, because it seemed to me it's almost the opposite of the photos that you were just mentioning. It's a Black woman in a space that up until now has been entirely or largely inhabited by white men. And even with the bicycle and the robe and all the rest of it, I'm just wondering if she's sort of claiming a space there, even through that photograph of herself, or if that's overinterpreting.
That is not overinterpreting, and I'll do that, we'll do that, and then I'll come back to the St. Anne's student record. It was as staged and as intentional. She says nothing to me. There's nothing in the record that describes who took the picture. That's what, who's holding the camera there, and how all of that happened. But it's such a quintessential Oxford staging that it captures so much about her. One of the most interesting things to me is, of course, that she's got that bicycle. She learned to ride a bicycle as an adult at Oxford. She'd never ridden before. She got a bike, she fixed it up. She became, part of the student body in that way. And it was that bicycle that later she fell off and broke her leg, which then caused all sorts of consequences for her finishing her degree. So I see so much in that photograph based on what I know in terms of the backstory, but it is still as riveting to me now as it was when I first saw it. And even as I was able, when I was there, obviously I walked by that ring every day and was able to sort of stand in that spot and try to imagine the vast differences between her there in the 30s and my there, on the Harmsworth in 2018, 2019. The St. Anne's student record is extraordinary, because in this country, I would not have had access to it because our privacy laws are much different and there are all sorts of restrictions. And yet it was one of the richest archival finds, because it's one of the few places where I have both sides of correspondence. That is, I have her incoming, so to speak, to Oxford, but I also have the notes and records from the folks at Oxford and the back and forth between them. And so it's what I'm able to use to show her struggle to succeed, and also their commitment to help her succeed, but also the ways in which she tried their patience, because she was a very strong-willed and demanding person. And so it's still, that the file is still there and open.
And we can read more about it in the book, no doubt.
Yes.
Perhaps I'd just like to put the audience on notice that in about 5-10 minutes, we'll open this up. Probably, it's just past. So probably in about 10 minutes, we'll open this up to questions. So do please put questions in the chat if you have any that you want to ask Barbara, and I will no longer hog, as it were, the microphone or to ask these questions. But before then, there's a little further journey I'd like to go on. If we could take not so much away from Tate, but to think a bit more about the broader context of your own writing. Because you mentioned just now that you stood in the same space as Tate in front of that little bit of railing, and that you did so as the Harmsworth professor. Now that's something that she could never have done, right? So something has happened over that time that means that you can stand in that place and, in a sense, own that place differently. So I'm just inviting you to reflect on your own life as a Black woman, a Black intellectual historian, and hers, and draw out some of the, if you like, the parallels. I'm not going to ask you, who funded your trip to Oxford and all the rest of it in quite the same detail, but if there are parallels, draw them out, but also some of the differences. about the sort of, between the two of you, your subject and yourself.
Yes. Well, when I arrived at Oxford for the Harmsworth in 2018, I had been there a couple of times before to do research on her and wanted to give a talk in the history department. So I had some sense of, Oxford. It was quite different to live in it, to be immersed in it. And as I said, to walk by that, that staging area every single day. I think the first thing I was reminded of was the enormous privileges of resources that are available to me, considering that the subject that I was studying was really financially destitute, and not least because of the banks failing while she was there and not having access to whatever American funds that she did have. But also the way in which I was welcomed into that community, not from the margins, which is where she lived and was able to get her work done, but in a much more central space. I will say I was still very much aware of how singular my being there was and how exceptional my being there was. That really hasn't changed, so much. And so I was always really, really aware of that. But at the same time, I think one of the interesting things about the physical plant and the physical infrastructure there is I could with pretty much certainty think I was seeing pretty much what she was seeing in terms of because of the historic nature of so much of the architectural infrastructure. And that was an interesting, that was just very interesting to me, as well. So
I'm sure that I don't want to interrupt you. I think of course, the architectural infrastructure is very similar, but as you're sort of suggesting, some of the ideological infrastructure is also clearly still there. And it seems to me that something that I've picked out, one of the sentences that you wrote about her, she said she confronted discriminatory practices in daily and scholarly life and carried the obligations of racial and gender representation. That must be true for you. It must be true for our Black students today in Oxford. And I just, again, invite you to reflect on that continuing story and maybe how we change it, but also just what are the conditions of possibility that make that still the case?
Yes, and I think one of the things that was interesting during the year I was there is that you develop relationships with Rhodes Scholars, including in that year, there were 10 Black Rhodes Scholars from the US. And so I got to know them. And in their hearing about Tate, I think their lives and their experience of Oxford was much closer to hers than mine, since they were students. She was a student. And so, I think the thing that really broke her spirits at Oxford when she failed her Viva the first time, or Viva, I guess the first time, was that she writes poignantly about how she felt like she essentially was failing the whole race, but that it also would mean that Oxford would never again take a chance on admitting another Black woman because she failed. And I think it's in that moment where you feel the burden of representation, the burden of racial representation, the isolation, and the drive and the ambition that's tangled up in that for her. When I came to Oxford as sort of moving towards the end of my own career, much older than Tate was, when she was there. And I was, as I said, I was treated like a very welcomed guest. And so but the need and the interest in issues related to race and questions of racial isolation there, coming as I did in the wake of Rhodes Must Fall, which was a couple of years before I arrived. I think one of the things that was most interesting to me is the intensity of the interest, students, faculty, whomever, in questions of race in that moment, and a particular interest in African-American history, and an eagerness to want to know more and to learn. But I think that I say this, and mean this in no disrespect, but certainly Oxford was the whitest and most male space I've been in since I worked in the Senate as a staffer in the 1980s. here in the United States, where, so I guess I've had some reckoning with those issues, throughout my life, having gone from a segregated school system in Virginia, which I was raised in, to the University of Virginia, in the first class of women, where there were maybe 350 women out of 25,000 students, and fewer still of Black women and Black men. And so I understand entirely what it means to be the only one, or to be one or two, and how you navigate those spaces and keep yourself intact, know why you're there, and also have some sense of, you do need a strong sense of your core and your own motivations to kind of stay on the path that's best for you, because you can otherwise be buffeted so much by the good and the bad of being in those positions.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing effectively a good deal of your experience, including of the continuing whiteness and maleness of this place. It's an alarming thought that the place that we're most like in the US is the Senate. But I mean, I'm sure it's true. And in fact, having spent a bit of time in US universities, it is very striking how different the university's sort of sector and university life in the US is still to how we conduct ourselves here in Oxford still. So that's a challenge that not only her life, but also your life presents us, I think. If I may, and there may be students and or others, colleagues within this call who'd like to raise any or all of these questions as we go through. I'll urge you to have to put some questions in there soon. One last thing I'd like to pick up on, though, is the sort of the theme that you set out right at the beginning, which is of an anti-racist geopolitics. And again, part of the internationalist agenda of her life and her work, because towards the end of both her life, and again, I'm not going to try and entangle you two together too much, but also your life, the larger dimension of racism beyond the US has become a big part. I mean, it became a big part of her work, and it's also been a part of your work towards in the last few years. You were part of this collection, for example, Women and Religion in the African Diaspora, that takes it beyond the US and beyond the particularities of that situation. And I was very struck by the degree to which Tate herself got involved in not only India, but also in Hawaii and in Pacific Island questions. I mean, clearly this idea that there's a kind of a geopolitics that if it's going to be anti-racist, it really needs to be global in a strong sense, was already there in her work and has informed your work as well. Again, I'd invite you to reflect on that question.
Okay, I think this I'll be happy to do that. I think one of the things that it also coincides with is one of the big challenges for me in writing about her and writing about not so much her life, but her work, which is that I am a provincial African-Americanist. I do study the US and that's what I know. This book would have been done years ago if she had done the same, because it would have been much easier for me to figure out her work. But because she had this capacious intellect and these broad interests, I've had to learn so much just to understand and appreciate her work as a layperson, so to speak, outside of the particular fields in which she works. And so one of the challenges was trying to find some connector to someone who is studying disarmament, the Pacific, then she's in Africa, she's got all of these interests. So what's the underlying theme that could work? And I came up with this notion of an anti-racist geopolitics, because in everything, she has a really scathing critique of colonialism from the beginning, and of the relationship between colonialism and race and imperialism, so that many people who had an anti-imperialist critique were not drawing a line to race. And she takes that racial lens to Hawaii and the South and Southwest Pacific, certainly in Africa, and it's even in the work on disarmament. So I think the other thing I want to say about Tate and me, as you keep pushing me to say more about me, but I think one of the things that I've struggled with is that I have not lost sight of the fact that Tate is a historical subject to me. Mm-hmm. She's not my friend. She's not someone I know. She's not what I ever knew. Even though I have been immersed in her life for a very long time, I still have tried to keep some academic, intellectual a distance between me and her, and to see her as a historical subject. And I think I've done that for a couple of reasons. One, to try to keep the book, I mean, it's not all laudatory. I mean, I read critic and critiques of her in the book, but I also, I had to decide what my relationship was going to be with her. And I think that's the relationship that's worked for me to get through the book. Once the book is done, I think my relationship to her and the emotional engagement I have with her will come to a head in a different way. I will grieve that, I don't have the luxury of doing that while I'm still in the process, or I'd never finish. And so that's been one of the challenges, I think, of doing biography. And I can so easily see how over-identification with a subject can not ruin, but is a challenge in the book. And so if anything, I've been doing this. And so the spate of questions you've been asking me are questions that I might be able to answer a lot better once this book is actually in covers.
Okay, well, that's an invitation, if ever there was one, to ask you back again once the book is out and up there.
Yes.
I mean, and it'd be great if we could do that. And I must apologize if you think I've been kind of pressing you. It just felt to me that
no, it's a central issue, because people who've read bits of the book and friends and colleagues, I mean, especially in this age where people are so much more willing to put themselves in the work and to, use the I word, which I use in some of my own work. And I have really struggled with what is my relationship to her and what is my relationship to the project. I think because there is a way in which over-identifying with her would in some ways be overwhelming to me as a writer, as a scholar, as a human being who's basically, just trying to deal with the difficulties in her life with sympathy, but also maintain some sort of critique.
Yeah. I think, again, in my other identity or my other life as a Torch director, I've been involved in a good few discussions with biographers who similarly talk about this kind of challenge of over-identification on the one hand, but also what then do you do when you find that there are things that you would like to critique, either about the individual or about the structures that made that individual the way they are. And perhaps to finish off this particular bit of the discussion and then encourage questions, are there things that, if you were her, you would want to do differently? Or to put it another way, are there things, particular issues of critique that you've discovered the better you've got to know your subject?
I think that's a really difficult question. I mean, there are things. So the question is, if I met her, would I like her? In the end, so. Is that not it?
Yeah.
And I think about that because I was living in Washington during the time she was there. I never met her. I did not know her, but it makes her life there more legible to me in certain ways. I think if I had met her, I would be intimidated by her and by her intellect and by all that she was. And I say that after wallowing around in her archive for a decade now. And I think, so there's that, and I would be respectful of her. But I also know that there's a part of her that was sharp-tongued and critical itself. And so I think I would have been a little bit in awe. And I've tried not to be that person as the author of this book, but that's actually probably the truth, especially the kind of reverence that she had for education and her struggle to become a scholar and to basically imagine that ambition for herself and to realize it and be extraordinarily successful at it, and then also to be lost as she has been to history. And so I think that's where I am with that.
Right. Thank you. Well, certainly one of the things that your work has done is to recover her from history, and we very much look forward to reading the biography, as well as putting together the various things that you've written about her over time.